Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GoldFish Report. I'm your host, Louisa. Today is Friday, January 19th, 2018. I have to get used to saying that. Today's Friday, and this is our weekly Country Roads with Winston Shrout. And we have our friend Winston with us today. How are you, Winston?
Well, doing okay. Hello to everybody.
Winston, it's been so good. I've been seeing you like almost every day this week. We've been doing reports, and you've been such a good sport and a really good friend of the Goldfish Report, and joining us on many interviews, folks. We have so many interviews for you coming out, and you're going to be very excited. We have a new Cobra interview. We also have an interview with Rob Potter, and we have an interview with Captain Randy Kramer, who you all know from the 20 and Back Mars program. So, we're really cooking here. We really, really are. We're trying to bring you the latest information. So we hope that you appreciate it. And I'm going to just let Winston, now we're going to talk today about a very interesting story. Many of you may not even know about it if you're really young, and those of you who aren't probably know about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And the reason Winston wants to talk about this is to really kind of highlight some heroes, or a hero in particular, that maybe we could all look up to and learn from. And then we're going to go into some examples of, he wants to talk about the masters of the Far East and how they deal with forgiveness, and most of all, how to remove ourselves from this 3D hologram so that we don't drag that karma with us. So it's always timely. All these things are connected, and it just sounds wonderful. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say, Winston.
Well, before we get into all those serious things, maybe we ought to have a little bit of humor. I kind of like to start things out with a little chuckle. And because, I am a hillbilly, it's okay for me to tell hillbilly jokes. I'm also Irish, so it's okay for me to tell Irish jokes, so I can be politically correct. But anyway, this is just a little humorous poem. It's called the Hillbilly Poem. Let me get to that. Let's see here.
You know what happens, Winston, when you get me laughing. I have no off button. It's more like a dimmer switch.
It's just good for a little chuckle.
Cool.
I gotta say, I mean, this could apply to anybody, but we like to talk about hillbillies. Anyway, this is called Hillbilly Love Poem. So it goes like this: Susie Ann done fell in love. She planned to marry Joe. She was so happy about it all, she told her pappy so. Pappy told her, Susie gal, you'll have to find another. I just as soon your ma don't know, but Joe is your half brother. So Susie put aside her Joe and planned to marry Will. But after telling Pappy this, he said, there's trouble still. You can't marry Will, my gal, and please don't tell your mother. But Will and Joe and several more I know is your half brother. But Mama knew and said, my child, just do what makes you happy. Marry Will or marry Joe. You ain't no kin to Pappy.
That's funny. That's an unexpected twist to the story. That's pretty funny. Oh man, that is funny.
Yeah, it's just a good funny story.
It is. It's very funny because them kissing cousins down there.
Well, I was around those people growing up and all those kind of things, and no, I didn't see anybody marrying their brother or sister.
Well, that's because you were in Kentucky, but you go down a little further south to Tennessee, and you just see something all different.
No, actually not. I did have second cousins who married. Actually, I had two of those incidents. But if you look at the statistics and the genetics, once it gets out to be second cousin level, it has the same probability of birth defects as the general population.
Interesting.
Now, first cousins certainly are brothers and sisters. It's a whole lot different thing, and we see this played out. For instance, some of the Polynesian royal families married brothers and sisters, to keep it in the family. We see some of the European royals doing the same things. So that does cause problems. And again, referring back to what we had talked about with that one particular book that we had talked about, Pleiadian perspectives. When some of the first colonists arrived on Earth, some of the Pleiadian colonists first arrived on Earth from Venus. Either they had forgotten or they were not properly instructed. But they did find some problems by marrying too close. And so it's an interesting story. But in any event, no, we have learned, certainly scientifically and just by plain old common sense from years past, the dangers of interbreeding too closely. And so we try to guard against that. And this hillbilly love poem kind of points that out when the mother told the daughter, "Don't worry about it. You're not even kin to your pappy."
It's funny. It's like language that, although I'm a Yankee, I grew up, my half my family's from the South, and my mother, I always remember her referring to Mammy and Pappy, which were the grandparents. They were the grandparents.
Yeah.
Funny.
Well, you get into colloquialisms, like when I was growing up, the generations would refer to the old man. Now, in some societies, you don't call your father the old man, and we wouldn't to his face, but actually in the next generation, it was a title of respect. The old man this, the old man that. And then finally, I got to be the old man. So I proudly wear that title because I am the old man, and the old man better be listened to. Let's put it that way.
He's shining the light. Winston's shining the light for all of us. So.
Oh, it's just like I say. It's just societal thing. But but we use titles or we use things like that sometimes in a disrespectful manner, but at other times, other places, it's actually a respectful title. And so, any of my kids referred to me as the old man. I mean, I'd be proud as a peacock, because they recognize my position.
Sure.
So, like I say, it's just,
that is respectful.
Yeah, it's just where you're from.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, in many of the religions and so forth, they refer to the Ancient of Days as being, the ultimate God or whatever. So, again, the Ancient of Days, the old man. so I don't take it personally as disrespectful. I mean, I take it, like I say, I'd be proud if somebody called me that. But anyway, let's not get into all that stuff.
Okay.
What I want to do today, I'm of the generation of people that had to deal with the Vietnam situation. Now, I was in the Marine Corps during that era, but I was not involved in combat or any of those kind of things. Actually, I spent my 4 years in the computer room. But in any event, but many of my generation were severely scarred by that, not just those who were involved in the combat, but because of the negative karma that was generated by it. And so, during those days here in the country, I mean, it was unpopular to some and popular to some. And so, because of the perception of people generally, we had a certain amount of polarization over that situation. And now here we are 40 or 50 years later, and many of those same scars are still prevalent, and we see it. Now, I'm not speaking to the present situation with the Iraqi situation, the Afghanistan, and the multitude of other things that go on, but I wanted to refer particularly to this particular incident, not so much to discuss the massacre itself, but to point out a hero. This is a real bona fide hero in that situation. And so I wanted to point out some of his personality strengths and so forth as an example. As an example, that if we would take those same qualities into our own life and the things that we do, then perhaps things would go a little bit better. Because not so much on the level of armed conflict, but right now in our present situation, we have the financial massacre going on, the massacre of the innocents. And then also we have this problem with this huge pedophilia problem. Again, the massacre of the innocents. And so, as an individual or as a people, could we learn from the actions and the qualities of this hero from the My Lai situation? And I think people will be, we don't do hero worship, but certainly, when we see those who demonstrate strong personality characteristics, then we can certainly learn from it and emulate those people. So again, that's my purpose. Not so much again to go over the bad things that have happened, but again to point out what good things we could have if we looked into the life of a hero. So anyway, if you want to get into that, then I have a couple of publications that I can read from and point to, so that people certainly, like I say, you were just a baby when all this happened, and many of the listeners and so forth were not even on the planet, prior to those things. But some of us old timers, do remember those things, and so I think it would be a good thing for healing, because when we get through with the story, we want to go into healing and want to demonstrate how some of those things, could affect us, not so much because we participated in Vietnam, but because we are participating in the situations right now. And so what do we do about that? I mean, we had the Twin Towers fall down that caused huge trauma. And then all this pedophilia stuff has come up, and it traumatizes people. It literally traumatizes them. And so we need to look at, a few suggestions perhaps that would assist in healing. So that's kind of what I wanted to go into today. Not so much technology and stuff like that, but we have to look at these things, because if we use the technologies to solve the problem, on the financial matrix or some of these other things, then what do we do? And how have we approached that? And so we'll go through it, and then we'll kind of summarize and bring up some of those issues. So let me just get into.
I think one of the things that's most, I'll never forget that image of that girl running down the street. She was naked, and she was just like everyone. It's indelible in my mind, the image of her running during the Vietnam War, and it was really those marks. Those marks are definitely on many people's psyche for sure. Although
I'll supply these articles to you, but these are things you can easily find on the internet. This one was by PBS, Public Broadcast System. Mm-hmm. Major funding, by Liberty Mutual, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it says, meet the participants. It's talking about the My Lai article. The story of the My Lai massacre is cover-up, and the subsequent investigation involves hundreds of people. Not all the men of Charlie Company participated in the massacre, and even fewer were ever charged. Okay, so then we're going to talk about some of the main participants in that. The name of Lieutenant William Calley. He was basically what you call the company commander of Charlie Company, the ones who went into My Lai. And there was also another company that went in, but apparently this one was the one that perhaps caused some of the main main problems. Anyway, apparently Lieutenant Calley started out as an enlisted. Then he went to officer candidate school, but in this incident, despite his high rank, his men reported feeling resentful towards Calley, and many members of Charlie Company witnessed the captain, which is Captain Medina, treat the lieutenant with hostility and disrespect.
Hmm.
And so there was already some friction going on in this company, in this platoon.
But they call it a company because I don't understand those. So a platoon can be referred to as a company, you're saying?
Well, yeah,
Charlie Company.
you have squads, you have platoons, you have companies,
Oh,
and so really, Calley would actually be a platoon leader
okay.
of the Charlie Company, and so this Captain Medina was running Charlie Company. Lieutenant Calley was running the first platoon of Charlie Company, and the platoon involved several. Well, anyway, let's not get into military designations and so forth. Anyway, on the morning of March 16th, 1968, Calley, this would be Lieutenant Calley, commanded the first group of men to land at My Lai. It was Calley who gave the order to start killing the civilians. In action, he later defended as adherence to clear orders. Basically, we'll go into that a little bit. But anyway, the situation at My Lai was totally misrepresented by military intelligence. First off, they said it was a hotbed for Viet Cong operations, and that the people in My Lai were actually supporting the Viet Cong, making landmines and doing all kinds of things. And so the military intelligence was faulty from the start, because when they went in there, there was a certain expectation of what they would find. And when they got there, they found out that it was incorrect, but they still went forward as if the military intelligence was correct. Anyway, Calley was recalled to, after in '69, Calley was recalled to the United States and identified as the suspect in an official Army inquiry. 3 months later, he was charged with 6 counts of premeditated murder. Apparently, Calley was the first to be court-martialed in that incident after more than 4 months of trial and almost 80 hours of deliberation. The jury found Calley guilty of the premeditated murder of 22 civilians. His life sentence, however, was met with national protest. Now, let's think about what was going on in the country at that time.
Hmm.
Again, we have a certain polarization in our country about some who seriously objected to the Vietnam War and those who were totally in support of the government in their effort. Again, I think we reported in the past that Vietnam had been a French colony. Remember how we had talked about one of the efforts of the Plan of the Experts, that one we did on money.
Right.
One of the efforts of the Plan of the Experts was to remove colonization. So Vietnam was originally a colony of France. The French went in and fought with them for a long time. Finally, the Vietnamese run the French out of Vietnam. And at the end of World War II, an effort was made diplomatically for Vietnam to become an ally of the United States, which Truman rejected hands down. Had Vietnam become an ally of the United States, North Vietnam would not have gone communist.
Hmm.
And so, diplomatically, this whole thing could have been averted. So, that's a tragedy in and of itself. But anyway, then the United States certainly went in. It was all, as it later had been pointed out, the reason for going in was a false flag. And so that was the justification for armed conflict in Vietnam. Anyway,
But it was a false flag for
they blew
what?
up that. Yeah, they
For all
blew
the
up that.
drug, for all the drug
Well,
running they were doing.
well, yeah.
The
They
CIA
claimed
drug
they blew up
operation.
that ship in Haiphong Harbor, and
Right.
then that was the justification for moving troops in. Then again, the whole thing was turned into, I don't know if it started that way, but certainly it turned into a major CIA operation to control not only the drugs, but also the petroleum. Because, Vietnam, has a huge amount of seaports. And so they wanted also not only the drugs, they also wanted oil. So it's not just drugs, it was also oil. Anyway, like I say, the polarization in the country at that time is pointed out here because his life sentence was met with national protest, most of whom believed that Cali showed a courageous allegiance to his country. The Free Cali movement painted the lieutenant as a scapegoat for the government's failed policies in Vietnam and influenced the political atmosphere in Washington with effective protest. The battle hymn of Lieutenant Cali sold 200,000 copies, 5,000 telegrams sent to the White House, flags in Florida, lowered the half-mast. Anyway, like I say, there was a great deal of protest about the judge, the thing against Lieutenant Cali. Okay, under mounting pressure from the public, President Nixon intervened on April the 1st in 71 and ordered Lieutenant Cali released from the Army stockade and placed under house arrest. Cali's sentence was reduced the following August and reduced again April of 74 when he returned to the stockade. When he was released on parole in November of 74, Cali had served a total of 4 months in a stockade despite being found guilty for the deaths of 22 Vietnamese civilians. So again, we have a lot of strange things going on with this. And like I say, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on these kind of problems, but I'm pointing them out, for people who may not be aware of what happened during those times. But there is a lesson to be learned here. And that was Cali's defense was, I was only doing what I was ordered to do by my captain, who was Captain Medina. And Captain Medina was saying I was only doing what I was ordered to do by my superiors.
Mm.
So the question gets to be, if you know, as a soldier, as a corporate member, or as a citizen, or whatever, that you're being instructed to do something that is wrong, illegal, immoral, or whatever. The question is, do you do it? And that's the lesson that we should all learn from the Lieutenant Cali and Captain Medina storyline. But let's go on a little bit. It talks about Captain Medina. Apparently, he was wanting to make the Army a career. He was doing pretty well. He was moving up in rank and so forth. So he served in Germany. He came back. Again, he started out as enlisted. So returning to the U.S., he attended the Officer Candidate School, graduated as battalion commander of the cadet class. In December of 1966, Medina was sent to Hawaii as the captain of Charlie Company, and Medina earned the name Mad Dog. Got somebody now called Mad Dog something else?
Mattis.
Okay. Anyway, he was referred to as
BBC.
Mad Dog from his men during their training due to the endearingly tough and explosive stance he took with his men. The later investigation into the incident at My Lai revealed that Medina briefed his men on the eve of the 16th. During this meeting, he encouraged his men to be especially aggressive on their mission, and he confirmed that no civilians would be present in the village during the ground operation. So military intelligence was full of bullshit. Anyway, so on the morning of the 16th, they took off. Although his exact actions during these mornings are still disputed, according to the Criminal Investigation Division, more than 300, actually, I think the final count was 347. Anyway, more than 300 Vietnamese civilians were killed under Medina's leadership. A few soldiers reported Medina directly killing civilians on 3 separate occasions and abusing non-combatants on other occasions. CID would also report that Medina participated in reporting inaccurate death count. I think he reported something like, I don't know, 20 dead.
Mm.
Anyway, in 1970, immediately following the conclusion of the Pierce inquiry, now that was a general who made an inquiry into this particular situation. The Army charged Captain Medina with assault with a deadly weapon and premeditated murder. His court-martial occurred over the course of the summer. In September 71, a jury composed of 5 combat officers acquitted Captain Medina of all charges due to an overwhelmingly sympathetic courtroom atmosphere and the withdrawal of a key witness, Michael Bernhardt.
Hmm.
Now, again, one of the things that we've had to suffer with are cover-ups.
Right.
And this whole situation here obviously was a cover-up. But, that's some of the negativity of it. But what I really wanted to go into was a hero in this whole incident, and that would be Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson. So I'm going to leave off on this article. Here's a picture of Warrant Officer Thompson. And I want to go into a little bit of his history. But let's get to this. Let's see. Let me see here. Now let me get into this other article because it has more to do with him.
Hmm.
And so we want to look at a hero now.
Absolutely. I mean, but that's, that's, I think, a big problem that a lot of soldiers, it's a huge burden they have to carry the rest of their lives. I guess they really didn't realize how traumatizing it would be for them to go in, even under orders to kill, and then they have to, even though they're told it's the enemy, it really, once they're either the intel's wrong or they're manipulated or whatever,
Well,
these
the key to
soldiers.
it was, though, that even though the intel was wrong, when they went in, some of Charlie Company participated and others absolutely refused.
Hmm.
So it wasn't the whole company. Not at all.
Why was that?
Because of their own moral conflicts,
Conscience. Yeah.
their conscience. I mean, they were fed wrong information. Wouldn't that tell
But
you or me to stop?
did they know it was wrong at the time?
Well, they were instructed when they went in, there wouldn't be any civilians there. But when they got there, the whole place was full of civilians. So what do you do?
Mm.
Now, so let's go on with
Yeah.
the story about this hero here, and you'll see some of the things, firsthand accounts. So again, this particular article, again, from PBS, and I'll send these to you. Or you just look it up on the internet. This is just some of the ones that I found,
Mm.
but there's plenty more on the internet. Anyway, this interview was with this Larry Colburn. What Warrant Officer Thompson was doing, he was flying a small helicopter. They called it Shark. And it was not really a gunship, but they did have a pilot and 2 gunners aboard. And what they would try to do is swoop in and try to draw fire so they could locate any enemy in the area. And so that was the job, that this Hugh Thompson had volunteered, of course, to do. So let's go into just a little bit of his history. Okay, let's see. Is this the article I want? Yeah, I think it is. Anyway, so this Larry here, who's giving a lot of this report, was one of the gunners in the small helicopter that was being piloted by Hugh Thompson. And the other gunner was a fellow named Glenn Andriota. I can't say that word. Andriota. Am I saying it right?
Andriota.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a hard enough time with hillbilly names. But again, some of these Italian
The
names.
Italian. There
I have
you
a
go.
hard time. You'll have to pardon me. Like I say, I'm not too good with names. Anyway, this team was responsible for the rescue of several Vietnamese civilians, during the massacre. And Thompson was the first to communicate back to headquarters about the killing that was occurring on the ground. Upon returning from the mission, Thompson reported what he had seen and experienced to his superiors, causing them to begin an investigation. And Thompson also urged Colburn to do the same. 2 years later, Thompson and Colburn both testified at the Pierce inquiry. Again, that was that general that was doing the investigation. Larry remained with Hugh, who passed away in 2006. You can learn more about the Hugh Thompson Foundation on that website. Anyway, in this interview in 2009, Larry has discussed Hugh Thompson, what their role was at My Lai, and how that day affected the rest of their lives. So anyway, now you go into the discussion of this helicopter job that they were doing. It was a small helicopter, like I say, carrying 3 passengers, a pilot, 2 gunners, and their job was basically to draw out the enemy, see if they could attract enemy fire so that the gunships or the troops on the ground could locate where the enemy was. And so it was a pretty dangerous and a daring operation they were doing. So anyway, the question they asked this Larry, again, Larry Colburn. So the question they asked Larry, do you remember the first time you fired that gun in anger? What was that like? He said, I remember the first time I saw a person try and shoot me. So they were flying low level, approaching spider holes in the dike, and I remember thinking, if I were a Viet Cong, I would be right there. And sure enough, as soon as we aligned ourselves with that hole, I saw a head come out of the hole, and I saw a muzzle. I saw the person point the weapon at me and fire. I got a couple of rounds off, my gun jammed, and he almost, anyway. Then he talks about asking questions. So what does it take to be a pilot? And so Larry says, well, I think pilots generally are thrill seekers and they're willing to take chances. You have to be an effective pilot. You have to be able to some degree to put your own safety aside and to do whatever it takes to complete the mission. So he asked him about Hugh Thompson. What was he like? He said, the thing I'll never forget about Hugh Thompson is his sense of humor, his swagger, and his southern charm. He was notorious in the gun company because he was a character and a very, very good pilot. So here we have a photograph of Hugh Thompson, as a young man during that era. His background, apparently he had enlisted in the Navy early on, and then when he left the Navy, he got into the Army basically so he could go to flight school, and so he became a warrant officer in the Army. So he knew both sides of the equation as far as being enlisted or as being an officer. And then he talks a little bit about the relationship of the enlisted personnel, with the officer corps and so forth. And, you have to keep a certain amount of distance in some of those situations, but because of the nature of military. Anyway, said he had a kind of a John Wayne swagger going on. The way he walked, the way he talked in his thick Southern drawl. He was from Stone Mountain, Georgia. He went to school there, and he wore a rebel flag on his flight helmet. He said he was just a character, and he loved to laugh. Said he had a lot of self-confidence. He was Cherokee. His father's father walked on the Trail of Tears, and he used to tell me about his childhood and so forth. But the main thing there was he knew the difference between right and wrong. Absolutely. He had a very profound feeling for what was right and what was wrong. He had a very solid moral footing, if you will, and he had the blood of a warrior. He was a Cherokee. You know what? I had highlighted some of these things, and I want to. I think I pulled up the wrong one. Let me see if I can go back and find this other, because I have certain things highlighted. So excuse me here for a minute while I go look.
Sure.
All right, continuing on here. What I'm trying to emphasize is that, you know, he had a history as a warrior. His grandfather apparently had participated in the Trail of Tears. I think a lot of your viewers would probably be aware of that historical thing and so forth. But in any event, because of his upbringing, his parents were very careful with him. And that was, you know, he learned what was right and wrong pretty early. And that continued with him. And so he absolutely had a strong feeling about what was right and wrong. So this question this interviewer asked, it says, how do these two things mix? On the one hand, the sense of right and wrong, and on the other hand, the blood of a warrior. What was he like in combat? My idea of this is Larry. Said my idea of a warrior is partly to be honorable. In combat, he was ruthless when he needed to be, but he did not indiscriminately fire on people. There was a period of time when we were conducting what's called snatch operations, and it was basically kidnapping draft-age males if we saw them in the field. We would take them on the first helicopter ride, and then he goes to talking about one particular occasion when they found a man standing in the field, and so they swooped down, and they could have killed him because he ran. And so they tried to fire warning shots in front of him. He just turned and run the other direction. And so it was kind of so anyway, the response of the pilot, Officer Thompson, was simply to land. Basically, they didn't land the craft. He flew close enough that this Larry fella could jump out and grab this guy. And okay, but here's the point. So the gunner said, what should I do? He said, unload your gun, put it in the bubble, take your seatbelt off, get on the skids. I'm going to get really close to him and you can tackle him. I was 18 and I said, okay. We weren't taking any fire. It was a relatively quiet operation. And that became something that all the gunners and crew wanted to do. They wanted to tackle people off a helicopter. It's called bulldogging. But anyway, talking about Thompson again, he said he had a real sense of humanity and when to use force and when not to use it. And so this Larry apparently tackled this guy. He says, but we took him in, and he was actually carrying a card that said, don't take me in for interrogation. I've already been interrogated 15 times. I'm challenged. And so, in essence, this was a mentally disturbed individual. And so if they'd have shot him down, they would have been killing a pure innocent. And so that's the point of this story Larry's telling here about the actions of Thompson in these situations, that he had that degree of integrity, that he simply just didn't kill people for no good reason. Now, there was another situation we'll go into here in a moment, perhaps, and that was they did encounter at the start of the My Lai a Viet Cong that did shoot at him, and they returned fire at him, and he got away. But that, as they pointed out, that was the only encounter that whole day of anyone resisting or shooting at anybody from My Lai, you see. But anyway, the point of this, that Larry's telling here was what Thompson's integrity was and always was in any kind of situation. So again, we're looking here at a hero, and that's my point. And so anyway, to get on the story a little bit, I say to the very talented planet, it says, he talks about how they flew, some of the missions and operations and so forth. Then the question is, he doesn't sound like he had much fear himself. And then Larry says, if he did, in other words, if he did have any fear, he hid it quite well. What was his attitude towards war? We didn't discuss politics or justifiable war. We were preoccupied. We just wanted to go home. He says, I guess, so the question is, I guess for a group of guys whose main goal was just to get home and not die, being with Hugh was probably a good thing. And then Larry's response was, Hugh Thompson never lost a crewman. And Hugh Thompson never lost a crew member in his entire career as a pilot, and he was extremely proud of that. He got everybody home safely. Okay, so everybody wanted to fly with Thompson because
They
of
knew
his
they'd come back
reputation.
home.
Yeah,
They'd know they'd get back home.
yeah. And then he talks about the Tet Offensive, so forth. Then you talk about, when they would go on a mission, military intelligence would, tell them the conditions, I mean, there might be a hot area, there might be some real shooting going on, all those kind of things, or it might be another kind of a mission and so forth, which is key to understand because when they first went into My Lai, military intelligence were basically telling them it's a hot area and there's no civilians there.
That's terrible.
Okay, so he says, take me through, what went on. He said, first off, the artillery opened up to kind of soften the place up a little bit. So we came in at altitude, dropped down and started flying low level. And the first thing we encountered was an enemy suspect. Says we came up over a hill. The guy didn't hear us. He was in the middle of the rice paddy in between two tree lines. We caught him out in the open. And Thompson says, I'm going to take him on the right, which meant it was my job to fire on him. And he was carrying a carbine and a pack. He was obviously Viet Cong, and he was evading, and I couldn't hit him. He says, I winged him a couple of times, but he made it to the tree line and got away. He got off a couple of shots at us. I think we called in a gun run in on him. But that was the only Viet Cong or the only enemy suspect I saw that day. All right. So he said, what happened next? He said, well, we started to check the perimeter. He said, what we do is, fly into the center and make concentric circles out, further and further out on the perimeter just to try to draw fire to see if anyone was there and to clear the place for the ground troops that were on their way in. So how much fire were you taking? He said, just one carbine. First thing in the morning, we were not receiving fire. Now, see, one of the problems that Thompson brings up later on was that in his position, in the helicopter he was in, he had absolutely no communication with the ground troops. If he saw something, he would report it up to the gunships. The gunships would report it up higher up, and they had communication with the ground troops. So there was a lack of communication, from the first in. The guys that went in first, they had, poor communication with the ground troops that were going to follow them in. So there was a problem with communication. Okay, I assumed that when we weren't receiving fire that day is going to be a better day for the guys on the ground for us. They could complete their combat assault and sweep through, clear the place, and get out of there. So there wasn't going to be much death that day. So what happened? He said we saw people leaving the area, which was not unusual. It was a Saturday morning. People would go to market on Saturday. We saw groups of men, old men, women, and children leaving the village. We didn't think it was unusual. The Army probably dropped some leaflets and so forth to warn them. Okay, so we, their thought was, well, great, they're getting out of the way. So they figured that they'd be in and out of My Lai, in 15 or 20 minutes. But so they were gone for about 15 to 20 minutes looking around the area. But when they came back, these same people, that was leaving the village, these same people were dead or dying on the road. That's when we started to mark wounded people. the way they would mark them, they would drop a smoke grenade, which would indicate, to the military personnel that these individuals were in need of medical attention.
Mm.
So we kind of lingered around, flying around the bodies we marked. One of them was a young female with a chest wound, but she was still alive. And we saw a captain with a squad of American soldiers approaching her. And Thompson decided he'd move back, stay at a hover and watch. And that's what we did. And we saw a captain approach the woman, look down at her, kick her with his foot, step back, and he just blew her away right in front of us. He said, did that surprise you? He said simultaneously, all three of us yelled, "You son of a bitch." She was no threat. And later on, they found out that the man who had killed this woman was actually Captain Medina.
Why was he so hell-bent on killing civilians and innocents?
You'll have to ask him. I have no idea why somebody would do that. Neither did anybody else, obviously. Anyway, was this unusual? It was. We didn't indiscriminately kill civilians. It wasn't our job. We were looking for Viet Cong in the North Vietnamese Army. Okay, so what? There must have been some recognition that something was wrong. You put together the evidence in some way. All right, so when we saw the captain shoot this woman, we knew who killed the other people.
Right.
Thompson went through every scenario he could to give benefit of doubt to the men on the ground. He did not want to believe that our people were doing this. He rethought the whole thing a number of times. It couldn't have been artillery. There was some testimony that perhaps some of the gunships, the bigger helicopters, might have been involved, or was it the Viet Cong doing this, or what was going on? I mean, they were stupefied. They couldn't understand what had happened to these people who were trying to leave, who were gunned down. Thompson, of course, was furious. So he gets on the radio, talks to the low gunships who, should have gone to the command helicopters flying the altitude, because, again, they couldn't communicate with the ground troops. Thompson could not communicate directly with the ground troops, which is really, logistically, that's really, really stupid.
Was that on purpose? Was that on purpose, maybe?
No, it was just stupidity.
Yeah.
Anyway, Thompson got on the radio and said, "This isn't right. These are civilians. There are people killing civilians down there." And that's when he decided to intervene. So anyway, Thompson, as the aircraft commander, after viewing this atrocity in its early stages, asked us, if we're going to do something about this, are you with me? And Glenn and Larry said, yep, we better act right now. So that, and they were willing to face the consequences of their action. It was so obviously wrong. And when you see babies machine gunned, you must intervene. So he said, what happened next? Like you said, they had marked with smoke or with flares some of the people who were obviously in need of medical attention. Anyway, even though they were marked for medical attention, they were I'm not going to say the word killed. I'm going to say murdered. They were murdered too. And then Glenn told Thompson about an irrigation ditch he saw bodies in. So they decided to take a look at that. So went and checked out this irrigation ditch, and when it got there, he had bodies in it, women and children and elderly people. Mr. Thompson noticed there was an American soldier standing right near the ditch, so he landed the aircraft. Now, this was a no-no. This was a no-no to land one of those helicopters on the ground.
What was it, like a Chinook helicopter?
No, a little small helicopter. It was only three-man helicopter.
Oh.
What they call it, Shark.
I didn't know what a Shark was. Okay.
It wasn't a gunship. The ones you see in all the movies and everything, they got the two-door gunners and all that kind of stuff. Let's call it, that would be a gunship. But what they were flying in was just a small outfit, a three-man size operation, which caused a problem later on.
Mm.
Anyway, Thompson checked out the ditch, had bodies in it, men, women, and children. He said, and again, because they couldn't communicate with the ground troops, he took upon himself to physically land the aircraft, get out, which was, you don't normally do that. You're a sitting duck. You don't land. It went against all the aerial concepts and so forth. He approached the soldiers near the ditch and said, they are civilians. We got to help them out. The soldiers said, yeah, we'll help them out of their misery. So Thompson pulled rank on and said, listen, soldier, these are civilians. We're going to help them. And he was also on the radio to the lower gunships, telling them what was going on. And the soldier said, okay, I'll help them out. I'll help them out. So Thompson got back in the aircraft, lifted off the ground, and then he heard automatic weapon fire. What happened to that soldier just machine gunned the people in the ditch. No mercy. And then Glenn, the other gunner, spotted some people in an earthen-type bunker peering out of a small hole and brought it to Thompson's attention. Thompson noticed that there was a squad of American soldiers approaching the same bunker, and he calculated they had less than 30 seconds to live if these people on the ground continued the behavior they were taking part in. So because they had no communications, again, he landed the craft in between the people in the bunker who appeared to be civilians and the approaching squad of Americans. Thompson got out of the aircraft, left it at idle. Anyway, he left the engine running and walked about 50 meters and faced this lieutenant. We took our weapons down, took some ammunition with us, and just set up a little perimeter around our aircraft and watched Thompson. He was in a heated argument with this lieutenant. It was obviously his body language. I asked him, can you describe the lieutenant? He said it was too far away. He couldn't hear what they were saying. The helicopter was running and so forth. But Mr. Thompson came back to the aircraft, motioned for Glenn and myself to come close. He said, I'm going to get the people out of the bunker. If these people fire on them, then when I'm doing that, shoot them. So he walked directly over to the bunker. He had a sidearm, but he didn't pull it. At that point, we didn't know what was going to happen. There could have been Viet Cong hiding in there. We saw 2 or 3 faces, children, women. He approached the small bunker and motioned for the people to come out. Glenn and I just turned around and faced the oncoming American squad.
Oncoming American squad. So they saw him land, and they were coming to see what his problem was.
Oh, yeah. To set the record straight, no one pointed any weapons at anybody. When Thompson gave that order, Glenn and I both moved our weapons away from this position directly down to the ground. And then we looked at these people. They stopped, and there was a stare down for a minute or two. And I remember looking at one American soldier waving to him as if to say, we're on the same side. And he waved back. And then I thought Thompson's going to pull this off. He's going to get away with this. So anyway, Thompson approached the bunker. 2 or 3 people, came out. As it turned out, I'll just tell the story. Anyway, a total of, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13 people came out, and of course they couldn't put them on their helicopter. So Thompson called in some of the gunships, like the ones you see in the movies, that could carry 6 or 8 people. And so he called these gunships in, and this one particular pilot came in, ferried the people from that bunker, far enough down the road to where this lieutenant and these soldiers couldn't kill them. So he saved all of their lives. What happened to these 12 people? No question, they would have died if Thompson had not intervened. So anyway, Thompson comes back, says he told us to cover him. He said, cover the aircraft, keep your eye on these approaching American soldiers. I'm going over to the bunker and get these people out myself. And if the American soldiers fire on these people or me when I'm getting out of the bunker, shoot them. And he said, Glenn and I were gobsmacked. We were standing there looking at each other. I remember thinking, how did we get into this? How did I end up here? To be
Jeez.
absolutely honest with you, the first thing I thought of was my mother. But trying to think what she would want me to do, and
Yeah.
she would want me to do. Anyway, they go into some of the other things, and then I want to get down to this next part down here because it plays into the solution or to the. Uh, anyway, Thompson, of course, went on a rampage. He reported it. Uh, Come on, computer, does it dumb things sometimes. Anyway, of course, Thompson, he's enraged. He's raising holy hell back at headquarters, giving reports and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think I want to go into that so much. But anyway, as part of the story, I mean, they talk about the inquiries. Anyway, getting back to the irrigation ditch where all those people were.
That's it.
Yeah, Glenn says he said he saw motion in the ditch. In other words, there was somebody alive in there. And so basically what happened was they waded in. I mean, it was, can you imagine? Anyway, they waded in and found a small child. So they grabbed the child out of it. I guess, the dead bodies had, piled in on top of this child. It turned out he was 8 years old. Anyway, the bodies had piled in on this child. Eventually, he was able to work his way back up so that this Glenn, saw movement and went and rescued him, having to wade through all this mess and so forth. It says, so Thompson knew that the Quang Ngai hospital wasn't too far away. He wanted to get this boy evacuated out of there. So we left the boy with the nun at the hospital. She came out and met us. He took the child, told the nun he probably doesn't have any family. And then, as the story goes, this young 8-year-old boy left the hospital, went back to give a proper burial to his family. Anyway, it goes on and tells the story of the consequence of all that. But more than anything else, I wanted to tell the hero side of it because of the example that was set. And then I want to get down into people can read this whole story if they care to, but I wanted to get down into so after all this was over with, I mean, they finally started giving Thompson medals and stuff, and then he finally died. And that's what this Larry's telling the story of how that happened. I'm trying to find one particular thing that was the result of this well, what happened was that Thompson went back to Vietnam on several occasions, and had been involved with humanitarian type work there. And eventually he met the man who had been that 8-year-old boy.
Oh man, you're kidding. Whoa.
Yeah, and he had grown up, and he asked him basically, what's your attitude now? And he did hate what had happened. He hated those who had done it. And so, but the position was of forgiveness. And then again, going with the Buddhist thought process, that in order to obtain forgiveness, one has to come and ask for it. And he was asked point blank, if Lieutenant Cowley came to Vietnam and asked for forgiveness, would it be granted? And he said yes. But again, you have to come and ask for it. And so that was kind of into that story. And I just wanted to bring it up, from the point of view of the action, which I would call appropriate action of someone who had a conscience, he had a heart, And even though he was thrust into a very, very difficult situation, he did not forfeit his moral character in order to carry it on. Now, having spoken to quite a few different ones who were there in that situation, of course, you hear the various reports, that had gone on there. One ex-Marine I'd known who had been a sergeant there, when everything was, getting friendly again in Vietnam, I asked him, I said, a lot of people are going, a lot of veterans and stuff are going back to Vietnam, just to look around and see what's what now. I said, are you going to go back? He said, no. I said, why is that? He said, there are still murder warrants out for me, because he had been doing just like what Callie and Medina had been doing. And so he was guilty of murder. He knew if he went back that he would be arrested and tried for murder in Vietnam. So, some of these situations bring out the very worst in people, but some of these situations bring out the very best. And so the ones that we want to learn from are those who exhibited, the very best moral character. And now, so we're getting into situations that we're involved in now, in our present circumstance. Are women and children being murdered? And the answer is yes. Now, all this hoopla and all this crazy stuff, going across the media and even the internet about all these things. They call it pedophilia. They call it human trafficking. But it's murder. It's murder of the innocents. And we've talked about this and the impact. I think in one of our interviews, we had talked about the impact that it has on the soul of people, when these things come to us. And so again, we're faced with the same dilemma, perhaps not as graphically as what these Glenn, Larry, and Warrant Officer Thompson were faced with. It's not that, how shall I say, graphic, so forth, but we are faced with the same thing. And that is, we talk about, financial problems, we talk about banking, we talk about foreclosure, we talk about all kinds of things. But the truth of the matter is, that we in our present situation are faced with not only the rape of the innocents, we're also faced with the murder, because when these children are used up, as they say, they murder them. Now, like I say, I have talked to one individual who was sent in to clean up, and he was sent to Saudi Arabia to clean up a mess of some of our political people. He named it to me, so I know who he's talking about. He named those who had kidnapped, taken these children to Saudi Arabia, done whatever, and then murdered them. And he was sent to clean up the mess. And so, I'm talking to people who have firsthand experiences with some of these things. To me, it's not rumors. I have firsthand reports from people who I trust to be telling the truth. Now, so we get into the same situation that we find. And so the question gets to be, do we have the same integrity? Do we have the same moral conscience that this Hugh Thompson had? And that's something we all have to look at. Because again, with all the distractions that keep going on, we are being distracted away from the seriousness of what we've had to experience. And so, we have all this human trafficking going on. And granted, there's some of it you can't do anything about, because we have, literally millions of people, including children, who are kidnapped and taken off planet. Now, I can't do anything about that. But again, just in our own world here on the surface of this planet, we have all these things going on. And so the trauma to the collective consciousness, the trauma to the psychic, of the people, it's very dangerous, very dangerous. And so the question would be, as individuals, what would we do about that, or what will we do about that when confronted with having to do something about it? Like I say, at one time in my life, when I was confronted with a very similar situation, because it eventually evolved into a murder of a dear friend, I got to the point, that I was carrying a gun. I had a sidearm all the time, hoping that I would have a chance to take revenge. And then finally, something clicked. And luckily, I did not involve myself in something like that. Now, as we get on to a little bit later down the road here, as we start to talk about, some of the healing and so forth that we can experience in some of these matters, then I'll get more into that. But again, we are in fact faced with, a very difficult choice. What will we do if we get into that position? And I just know that there's many people that might hear this, that might in fact be faced with this situation on a personal basis. And the question will get to be, in that instance, what will you do? It's fairly well rumored that a child abuser in prison doesn't live that long. Now, is that good or bad? I can't say. I'm not going to sit here and render judgment on other people's actions, but, we need to take a close look at this, because not only are we talking about the murder of children, but our whole society has evolved where that corruption and darkness are the accepted norm. Now, let's get into the Captain Medina, Lieutenant Calley thought process here. So even though you're not involved in the Army or involved in conflicts and so forth, it is typical, because we have participated in a dark system that we have created for ourselves. A great deal of negative karma, as we suppose. For instance, as I had mentioned up until this recently, perhaps approximately 50% of the American working force worked at some level in government. And that has been a very, very dark government. And so by being employed by that government, has that brought dark karma to you? Well, maybe it has, and maybe it hasn't. But again, like I say, when we start talking about, we've talked about these, 10,000 sealed indictments and people getting arrested and all these kind of things. How far down will that filter? Well, we don't know. We don't know. But certainly those who have been employed in that in that effort may in fact, have taken upon themselves some of that darkness. And so how do we heal? How do we get away from that? And so again, whether it's in government or in our financial institutions, I mean, how many people, due to the foreclosure situation in this country, have been forced from their homes, perhaps to live on the street? How many people how many people are living up under the overpass on the highways? And has there been anyone who has actually died from exposure? And so is that karma? Does that come upon us? I mean, does it come upon real estate agents? Does it come upon, banking people working in banks and all those kind of things? And let me suggest that perhaps some of that does in fact seep into. And well, for instance, a sheriff, who's got an eviction order, he just goes and does what? He just goes and does his job.
Mm. But he
And
chooses that job,
so
knowing.
is he in the category of a Lieutenant Cowley or a Warrant Officer Thompson?
Mm.
That's my point.
Right.
And so do we in our positions and the things that we do and so forth, what level of moral integrity do we rise to, even though the system says go and evict? Will a sheriff go and do that? Because he has the option to do it or not. And that's why we had, in one of our interviews, we had talked about the efforts of Sheriff Mack
Mm.
in educating the sheriffs and so forth, so they would understand, their true position. And so we rely upon those type characters to do the right thing, And if a sheriff sees something that he deems to be incorrect or even immoral, what should he do? It's the same thing with, well, I don't want to get into attorneys, but you see the problem. We have all become enmeshed in darkness, and we hardly know what to do. Like this one fellow, Glenn, he saw the irrigation ditch that was full of bodies of women and children, and he was repulsed. But he had the fortitude to wade into that. As a matter of fact, when he waded in and rescued that one child, he was actually mired to the point he couldn't get out of the ditch. And this other fellow, Larry, had to help pull him out. So again, when we get into these situations, that we're trying to correct, will you find a ditch? And will that ditch be so mired that you are repulsed and do not want to go into it? But in the case of Glenn, he said, okay, I'm here to rescue. I'm here to rescue a small child. He waded up to his waist in blood and gore, and and pulled that child out. Now, probably most of us will not get involved in a situation that dramatic, but you are going to come into situations where you have the choice to do something or not. You have the choice to do something or not do it. Which will be your choice? See, and this is the point. And so we would like to, encourage people to look at some of these stories. Some of them very, very dramatic. Some of them very, very dramatic. And probably you won't get involved in something that dramatic, but the principles are still the same. When you come upon a situation that you know to be improper, incorrect, illegal, immoral, what will you do? What will you do? You see? And so again, as we had talked about, the concept, the spiritual uplifting of ascension and all these kinds of things. If you're one of those who come upon a ditch and you don't wade in, what is the probability that you will ascend? I'm going to say 0, because you have not demonstrated the moral integrity that would be required of those who ascend. And so again, what I'm pushing for and have pushed for a long time as Solutions in Commerce is for people to become active, do things, that would cause a change. Are you going to get beat about the head? Well, look what happened to Warrant Officer Thompson. In the first instance, you know what they did to him? They sent him out on missions. The Army did, hopefully so he would be killed.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
He got shot down 4 times in a 2 or 3 month period. And the last time he got shot down. He actually broke his back, so he had to be evacuated. That's the only thing that saved his broken back is what saved his life, because the army brass was trying to cover up, and the only way they could cover up was to kill Thompson. Now this one other fellow, Glenn, who was the one who waded into the ditch. As it turned out, some months after that, he was actually killed in action. The other fellow, Larry, he lived through it all, and eventually, worked with Thompson, in civilian life and things like that. And he was actually there, when Thompson died at the VA hospital. Years later, I think it was, I don't know, 2006 or something like that. But in any event, how do we find ourselves? How do we find ourselves? What price will you pay for doing the right thing? And that's the question we all have to evaluate. And so again, the advice has been, pick your battles, and don't go don't get into something that you have no hope of solving. But at least, that's why I've produced this education program to educate people in the various areas we find ourselves in, whether it be in finances or in courts. I'm not much into politics and things like that. But in any event, when you find yourself into situations that you would consider to be, immoral or illegal or unconstitutional or whatever it might be, what will you do? And my position is you can be much more effective if you're prepared, to get into those things. So do you have any comments or questions? And then I want to get into another little deal here.
No, I think I think we've all already, faced those situations, maybe on a smaller level, maybe some of us not on a smaller level, but, I think that there are many factors involved in every circumstance. It's not always black and white. It's kind of like, did you know that they were like look at Edward Snowden, for example.
Yeah.
He did the right thing. I'm sorry, but some people might think he was a traitor, but I don't. I think he did the right thing. And I think that and it's not surprising what they did to Thompson, because look what they have been doing to Edward Snowden. I mean, if that guy laid foot on this soil, I mean, he'd be gone in, no time. But that's the problem, is that the deep state wants control, and they'll, killing a life is nothing to them. Absolutely nothing.
No.
Nothing. It's like throwing your trash out after you eat something. They have absolutely no remorse. And once we understand that that's what we're dealing with, we have to decide if that's the society we want. And because, like you said, it's we're enabling it because of our ignorance. That's why we need to, break the fishbowl and get out of the fishbowl, because we're not seeing the big picture. Only the reflection of our own little life and what needs to be done. And yes, that needs to be taken care of, but it's there's a bigger world out there, and we have to take responsibility for it. Even, that's why we're doing GoldFish Report. It's like, choke down that red pill. Choke it down, people, because we gotta inform people. That's all that we can do. It's our part, Winston, on GoldFish Report, is just try to, say, take a good look at this, and we've been demoralized. I mean, I've screen shared a video from the KGB operative whose plan it was to demoralize America to get them to the point where they would accept anything. And sadly, he admitted to how easy it was, and how they've succeeded in that far beyond how they could have ever imagined. So we have been totally herded like sheep, and we have to realize it, and then not. We have to take a stand, but we have to do it collectively. Start individually, and then we do it collectively, like you're saying.
Yeah, we've because of social movements and things like that, I think that that a lot of people did not and have not received the moral instruction that was needed to create a Hugh Thompson. And that's the problem. Like I say, as a young person, I mean, what in today's world, my parents would probably have been taken to court for child abuse. But let me tell you something right now. If you ever had your mouth washed out with soap, you learned the lesson real good.
Uh,
But today that'd be called child abuse. Now, how ridiculous is that? And so there is a master plan afoot to destroy the ability of children to receive moral instruction. And it's done in our public schools. It's done in our social environments. It's done on our televisions. It's done all these things. But again, if you go back and read that article about how this Cherokee boy uh, was raised, and his parents did not put up with foolishness. Like he said, his parents didn't believe in double jeopardy. If he got in trouble and come home, his mother would deal with it, and she'd say, "Wait until your father gets home, because he'd deal with it too." But the results of it was not child abuse. The result of it was someone in their formative years who had developed a moral code that would carry over into a war situation where it was havoc. It was havoc going on, life and death and so forth. But yet, he was able to maintain that moral character that would allow him to do the things that he had did. I mean, he was responsible for saving the lives, let's say, of at least 14 people, saving their lives. Now, and then this, I didn't read it on the interview, but this Larry asked, he was asked, did what was Thompson's attitude about that? He said, well, he was very embarrassed that he had not acted sooner, because if he had, perhaps he could have saved yet more people. You see what I mean? And so, uh, do I have that character? Do you have that character? Do the people listening to this interview, do they have that kind of moral character that they can perform in that same manner in whatever circumstance you find yourselves in? Knowing that if you perform like Thompson, if you perform like this Larry and this Glenn, are there consequences that would be thrust upon you for acting in that manner? And the answer is yes. You're going, it's going to hurt. But what is it worth to you? What is it worth to you? Again, going back to some of the sayings of Jesus, he said, in order to save your life, you have to give it. You see? And so, when we start to talk about this crazy third dimensional experience that we're having here, of what value is this experience to you? And you can make of it as you will. The opportunities are here. Now, one of the things that we have talked about, and certainly James Gilliland points this out every time he ever says anything really about going into your heart and putting a certain distance between yourself and the third dimensional things that go on. Getting back to some of the comments that have been made, that you can't solve a problem by repeating the same stupid thing every time. That's called insanity. And so you have to kind of step back and look at what's going on. And then, once you have a true picture, then you might re-enter the situation, to solve some of the problems. But again, if you simply stay in the soap opera, you'll never get out of it. And because you never get out of it, you don't develop the moral character that would allow you to ascend. Everybody likes that word, so I'll just use it. But it won't allow you to ascend. And so, some of those, who are working on spirituality and all those kind of things, I mean, have you overcome by your actions the situations that you encounter in the third dimension? Now, first off, let me explain to you, you are your own judge. You know, I can't judge you. Nobody can judge you. Everybody says God's going to judge us. And like Gilliland said, that's absolutely not true. If you'll go back and listen to James, some of James's interviews, he had pointed out that when he had that near-death experience when he drowned, actually, he went all the way back to source. And he found out that source, you know, never judged anybody. And so who does the judging? You know, we judge ourselves. We judge our own actions. And so who is going to determine whether or not you ascend? You know, is it going to be Saint Germain? Is it going to be Baba G, Mother Mary, Jesus? Who's going to determine whether or not you ascend? You are. You're going to determine that. And so what does it take to get to that self-realization so you can make that determination? And again, people need to take a close look at themselves, their own actions, and all those kind of things, and see whether or not, you know, that they're actually satisfied with what they've done and what they're doing. And so again, you know, that's something for self introspection. Like I say, I'm not going to judge you. You know, I might not associate with you. I mean, I wouldn't live next door to some of these pedophile child abusers. I mean, if I found it out, I might really get upset again and go back into my revenge mode. And I don't want to do that. And I don't suggest anybody else do it, because we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But you know, I'm not going to put up with it. I'm not going to put up with it. And so again, you know, people need to take, you know, a real close look at what they're doing. Now, I do have some others points I want to bring up. You know, I've talked about this particular book in the past. Can you see that okay?
Right, Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. Spalding, yeah.
Yeah. It's a really interesting book. I mean, it's a volume of 6 volumes of this. I think he actually published it in 1925, and he was involved with an archaeological group that was going to the Gobi Desert to discover some things, and then he ventured into the Himalayas, met many ascended individuals, and also several ascended masters. And so they got a chance to interview. I mean, right here back in this book, right page, what was it, 100 whatever. Anyway, they had a chance to sit down and talk to Jesus. Can you believe that? Man, what would you give? What would you give to sit down around a campfire, you know, and talk to Jesus and have him tell you things? Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, pardon my expression, I give both my left and my right arm for that.
Yeah, really.
But anyway, in these books, you know, there's quite a bit of information about their experiences and different things that happened. But in conversations, on one occasion with this, you know, this one individual, I don't know if he was an ascended master, but he was a very wise man, a holy man. And so they had a chance to talk about karma. And so I wanted to show this quote from this book. Let's see here. Here it is. All right. Now, this quote here is from volume 3 of this book. What this holy man told him was, karma does not exist. Now, I would say karma does not exist in and of itself. That's how I would say that. Anyway, okay. He says karma does not exist. Karma is but retribution for bringing into manifestation discord and inharmony. So his advice is substitute renunciation for retribution, and you correct the cause for karma as it exists only in the thoughts of those determined to manifest karma. Remove the cause or substitute it by a higher condition, and the lower condition is erased. You have elevated the vibrations of your body of above. You have elevated the vibrations of your body above those which allowed karma to exist. Now, this might be a whole new concept to people. Now, okay, so again, going back to that first phrase, as I explained, karma does not exist in and of itself. Okay, so it's not a natural phenomenon. It has to be created. And who creates it? We do. We do it on the quantum level. Like, Scott had talked about creating things, through the, what do you call it, scalar energy or something like that. It's same principle. The karma doesn't exist in and of itself. It's something that we have to create. And so, people, psychologists and psychiatrists continually work with people. And they're not saying these words, but what they're trying to do is get down to the root of a person's personality conflict. And they're trying to get that individual to realize they're the ones that caused the problem. They're the ones who actually created that karma. They're the ones who have inflicted it upon themselves. And like I say, we choose to be happy or we choose to be sad. I mean, we have people who are perfectly happy in some of the very most difficult situations imaginable. And then we have other people who are sad or plagued in some of the most pleasant circumstances. So it's not the environment, obviously, that creates the dilemma, but it's the attitude of those who are in that particular situation. They can choose whichever they'll have. And so again, in respect to what people are calling karma, you create it. It's not inflicted on you. Now, if that's the case, all right, so the suggestion of this particular wise man, he's saying, he says, substitute renunciation for retribution and you correct the cause for karma. So let's look at these two words, and I actually looked them up to get some kind of a good definition that we could work with. So the word retribution, the definition of retribution is punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. As an example, the employees asked not to be named, saying they feared retribution. Okay? So again, retribution is typically, one of the things we have to deal with. Again, if you stand for moral principles and do the right thing, will you be retaliated against? In many instances, you will be. And so to avoid that, many people simply don't get into a situation where they can be retaliated against for anything. It's kind of like what Jesus was talking about, when he said, I wish you were either hot or cold, either good or bad. He said, I wish you were hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, he said, I'll spew you out of my mouth. Okay, and so those who avoid some of these situations simply because they don't want the retribution or whatever, that's a bad spot to be in. So we need to either do good or do bad, because either of those two things can be dealt with. But when you do nothing, then you put yourself in kind of a bad spot. Do you have any questions about retribution?
No, I mean, but I think sometimes what happens is people realize when they know when they do the right thing that it's not the popular thing sometimes, and so sometimes people are still,
Yeah, we have
retaliated
to
against.
pick our battles.
Yeah, but just because you make the right moral choice doesn't mean there's going to be a good outcome for you. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
that's the dilemma most people have. And maybe that's their also think about it. I mean, that could also be their justification for not making the right choice because
I
they
know.
know there's going to be doing the right thing, sadly, causes retaliation.
Yeah.
That,
Well, what if Thompson had not acted?
right.
There would have been another 14 or 15 murders,
Yeah.
and his remorse was that he had not acted soon enough. And if he had have acted sooner, then perhaps there would not have been so many murders. And so again, that was his remorse. I mean, in the situation he was in, certainly I would not criticize him, because he once he found out what was what, then he did act.
Well, what about on the level of like the MK Ultra and they do things like these, you know, like it's one thing, okay, so Thompson was a really good example how he could be a soldier and not, pull that trigger on innocence. But when it's a little bit more murky and not so obvious when you're mind controlled to do things and you're not really aware you're doing them, what
That's
happens
true.
in that case? What happens in that case? It's really tormenting for people who've been involved in that, I think.
Yeah. Well, again, you'll have to judge yourself. Uh, but like I say, I have personally spoken to at least two individuals who were involved in MK Ultra training and operation, and
Mm,
when they realized what had happened,
mm,
then they came out of it. Now, would we hold them responsible for the things they did under that mind control? And I think pretty much any reasonable person would say no,
right.
no. And so again, if you're not in control of your psychic or your mind and so forth, and you do something under that kind of control, would you be responsible for it? And I would say no. Don't judge yourself for that, because that was not you. That was somebody else. That was something else. I'll put it that way. That's kind of an extreme situation, but from our day to day, the question is how will we do?
Mm,
So anyway, what this wise man is trying to impress, he says, substitute renunciation for retribution. All right, and you correct the cause for karma. Okay, so let's look at this other word, renunciation. Uh, what it means is the formal rejection of something, typically a belief, claim, or course of action. Uh, for instance, they use the case of a priest. Entry into the priesthood requires renunciation of marriage. Now, the priest, in order to do this, is not condemning marriage, but he's simply rejecting it as something that he will participate in. That's called renunciation. So let's go back to this concept of karma over here to see how these two things work.
mm,
So again, karma does not exist. Karma is but retribution for bringing into manifestation discord and inharmony. If you will substitute the concept of renunciation for retribution, you correct the cause of karma as it exists only in the thoughts of those who are determined to manifest the karma. Remove the cause or substitute it by a higher condition, and the lower condition is erased. Now, let me get into some of the concepts of Ho'oponopono. Now, I'm not a student of that. I'm certainly not an expert on it, but I understand the concept of how it works very well. Because, I mean, this is a technology, that I have been trained in, from my youth.
mm,
Again, as a Sunday school student, we didn't study Ho'oponopono exactly, but I have studied in great detail, the teaching of the Master Jesus and other men, who have those concepts. And so, if you look at Ho'oponopono, in essence, You are removing yourself, from the third dimension, and you're asking yourself this question: what in my life have I done, or what am I experienced that would draw this to me? In other words, you're outside of things, looking in and saying, okay, so there's the physical body. There's something being drawn to it. Why is it being drawn? Why is this experience being drawn to the body? And that's the real question. But the solution is, what do you do about it? And so then you go into the forgiveness. And if you go, read some of the stories about Dr. Lou, or what they call Haleakala. Oh, you want me to remove that, don't you?
Yeah, the screen share just while you're talking, so people can look at your face, because then we can see more of your spirit, and that spirit delivers that message. So
okay, well, but if you go study some of the stories attributed to Dr. Lou, and read those, I mean, in the one experience that it's perhaps one of the more famous stories about him. Of course, he was a PhD psychologist. He had taken a contract at a institution for criminally insane, and some of these on this ward had done very, very violent acts, even up to murder. Mm-hmm. And so he was contracted to go and work at this institution, and being an expert with Ho'oponopono, as the story goes, he never even interviewed one single patient. He simply went to work with Ho'oponopono, which basically meant that in his mind, he was saying, okay, why am I confronted with this life's experience? And what can I do? What can I do to correct what is being brought to me? And so then again, the statements of Ho'oponopono are basically, I'm sorry. Sorry for what? Okay. And so in his situation, or, as the story goes, I'm sorry that I have not recognized my divine creation. Please forgive me. He's telling himself, to his higher self, please forgive me for that mistake. Because obviously, as a divine creation, he's being thrust into a situation that obviously is not very divine.
Right.
You see? And so then he goes into, I love you and thank you, for this opportunity to cure and correct. Now, we had talked about, and we actually experienced this, if you recall back on that occasion when we were having that interview with Scott, when we had that attack, by the Greys. Mm-hmm. They were trying to interfere with our electronics. And so actually how we got it to go away was, first off, to recognize, the situation. And then tell it, we loved it, which always causes a great dilemma.
Yeah, sure does.
I love you, which again is part of Ho'oponopono. I love you. Thank you for your service. However, it's no longer required. Why is it not required anymore? Because we recognize it. We saw it for what it was. Just like, we had failed to recognize our divine creation. All right. So we recognized it. And so what we're saying is that, but because we have that realization, your services are no longer needed or required. Therefore, you're released back to source. Or sometimes you can release them to an ascended master or something like that, like how James does it. Mm-hmm. But in essence, can you hold for just a second?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, well, pardon us for that little break. Just had to get a drink, blow my nose a little bit. In any event, what we're trying to impress is that, this concept of this karma that we create for ourselves, through quantum or through scalar energy or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, we create the karma. And so the recommendation again, from this holy man in the Himalayas or wherever he was at, was to get out of retribution and get into renunciation. Now, you have to study the concept of renunciation, and so that's why I had pointed to the technique, the Hawaiian technique called Ho'oponopono, but also this other technique which we use, that's just a little bit different, where we actually recognize it, tell it we love it, for what it's done for us. And then say, well, okay, now that I've recognized that, I've had the experience, so thank you for your service, but your service is no longer needed. So now we're going to release you back to, Saint Germain or Mother Mary, or I just say you're released back to Source. And so at that point, if you'll recall, as soon as we did that, it stopped. So that's a real good technique. Sometimes we get attacked. Like I say, this one night I got attacked by what James calls these serpentine beings, and I just said, okay, I've had enough of this. So I went through this whole routine with recognizing it, loving it, which is hard to do sometimes, loving it, and then sending it back to Source, so Source can deal with it,
Right.
in whatever manner that's done. And so I think this is a real good technique. Now, when we get into some of the circumstances, we find ourselves in, we were talking about, this karma, this being created, like I say, there's many of my generation that still have those feelings about Vietnam, and some of the more modern ones have these feelings about, such things as Iraq or Afghanistan. We have a lot of veterans, some of these things. So, and again, and the public are also affected. Now, the effect of what's going on with Iraq and Afghanistan certainly is not nearly as dramatic as what happened during the Vietnam era, because again, being the children of the 60s that we were, I mean, there was a great deal of protest. A lot of people left the country because they didn't want to participate. There were riots. Going on across the country. So during those times, it was much more dramatic than it presently is. And so again, when we get into the our recent election and all of the karma, if I can use that word, regarding the election that involved this Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Oh my goodness. And so we're finally starting to settle down a little bit as the various elements have come out. And so hopefully people can clear the karma that they created, that's dragging them down. Because again, we're trying ever so hard to inspire people along spiritual lines and so forth, but you can't drag the karma with you. You can't drag it with you and expect to ascend any place. And so again, this information from this fellow up there in the Himalayas that he gave to these guys way back in the early 1900s, seems to be very, very good advice, very good information. We have these other techniques and technologies, like what Dr. Lewis put out and others, to help people to get past some of these problems that seem to plague us. And so again, my message today, I don't want to just keep running on and on about it, but was to demonstrate, first off, a very dramatic situation. First, I showed some villains, people who had done some terrible, terrible things. And then I showed you a hero who acted in an entirely different manner, and the results of those things. And so eventually it played out I mean, at first, he was being attacked, and then eventually he was recognized for what he had done. And so again, in our lives, in our individual lives, are we going to be villains or are we going to be heroes? That's your choice. But to be a hero, what qualities must you possess? And if you don't possess those qualities yet, what can you do to develop those things within yourself? That's what the message is.
It's a great message, and I think we have to realize that it's not always a moral dilemma that creates the karma. I mean, it's all choices, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, marriages, children, you know, things like that. That's all karma. I mean, everything we do is karma. So the question is, are you creating good karma, or are you creating, as you said, like dark karma, you called it? Are you creating dark karma? And um, it's
Well, it has been projected that something called instant karma. Now, I don't think there is any such thing as good. We say good and bad. The karma is karma. But anyway, uh, what generally happens? Let's say we do something bad, today, and then nothing seems to happen, but it finally catches up with us a year, 10 years, 20 years later. You know, Now, I have read stories of certain individuals or a certain group of people that uh, who who God had created instant karma. In other words, if you do something bad, bang, you receive the result of that right now. And so it didn't take those folks long to wake up. So if they did something stupid or bad, they got hit with it right then. You know, but in our generally in our world's experience and so forth, in our present time and so forth, we don't have instant karma. We have long-reaching karma, and so we have a tendency not to correct the problem until we're faced with a dilemma, which is unfortunate. And so again, I mean, well, we just have to work through these things. But again, we have the tools, we have the technology. And again, the one concept I wanted to emphasize was again what we call loving detachment. And that is to step outside of the situation, do a real analysis of it, which is not governed by your emotions. And then once with loving detachment, you recognize the problem, then you can re-enter the problem to solve it, to resolve the situation. So the concept of loving detachment is a real good concept to consider. And, when you're trying to correct, different things in your life. So again, like I say, we have a lot of work to do. I mean, you're not going to sin just because you're praying and meditating, folks. It's going to be what you're actually doing to enhance your moral perspective and to correct those elements that you would find to be undesirable. And so again, we've been faced with a totally immoral society. I mean, aside from a few teachers along the way and a few examples and so forth that we might encounter, such as this Hugh Thompson fella and this Glenn and this Larry fella. Look at the example that they showed, but how many times do you encounter that in your lifetime, so forth. So again, like I say, we have these examples, we have the stories, we have, people think, well, we're going to tell another story about Jesus or Buddha or about this or that. Hey, listen, we have some real life heroes. We have some real life heroes, that we can look to obtain, and to improve upon our own personal moral compass. And so when you read that story of that My Lai massacre, put yourself into the story and try to determine, well, what would I have done in that situation? And if you're dissatisfied with your answer, then get busy and try to work it out. Get busy and try to correct it. That's all.
Honestly, if I was in that situation and I had to look at the faces of those children, I'd have that like indelibly imprinted in my mind forever. And I would, if I didn't intervene, I think I would have always seen that and,
Yeah,
seen,
yeah,
knowing that that they were there and then, they were killed. It's tough. I mean, but people have to, realize that there are those instant karma moments.
yeah. Sometimes. But
Yeah,
again, we are in fact faced with that very dilemma right now, and so every effort should be made by people in communities, groups, religious, churches or whatever, to go on the offensive against uh, child trafficking. The Department of what do they call it? Human Services or
Child Protective Services.
Child Protective Services. That has to go. And again, community action will be necessary to get some of these things removed. And so, roll your sleeves up, get involved, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to the people in the churches or other organizations you might be involved with. Because again,
Why aren't
if
people outraged, Winston? Why aren't they outraged at this?
because they don't know about it, and we're trying to educate them to it.
Yeah.
And we're trying to bring these things to people's attention. And so again, it's one thing for one distraught person to go and complain about it. It's a whole different thing for 100 people to show up and
Yeah.
simply say, we're not going to put up with this. For instance, I was watching, it was a video that come out of Ireland, and there was some kind of a foreclosure kind of crazy thing going on. And so they were going to have this foreclosure deal. And about two or 300 people showed up and said, "Oh hell no, you're not.
Yeah.
Oh
Makes a
hell no, you're not
difference.
going to do that."
Makes a difference. Of course.
Yeah, listen, let me tell you something.
Yeah.
When you got two or 300 mad Irishmen and women showing up, government officials take notice.
Especially if they have a pint of Guinness. Don't give them a pint of Guinness and go to the
Yeah,
courthouse.
but you see what I mean. You see what I mean. If just one person had showed up to protest that action there on that fork, I can't remember exactly what it was about, the farm or something. Anyway, but if just one person had showed up to protest against that, the results would have been different. But when two or three, people showed up and not only said no, but hell no, you ain't going to do that. How did the banking and government officials react? They didn't do it. And so again, in your communities, in your neighborhoods, in your families, churches, and all these kind of things, if you'll take the initiative, and explain to different ones, maybe have a few families over to your house and talk about it. Here's what's going on. Here's what we can do about it. And then get actively involved. And I think a lot of people are doing that. I think a lot of people are doing that. So I'm not, so, but anyway, those kind of activities and so forth should be continued on. And I think we can start to, uh, get some of these problems removed. But these government institutions, which I think will be done away with, uh, you know, uh, these protective services are the only people they're protecting are the pedophiles, for crying out loud. And if you work for an agency like that, quit. Go find another job. And so, I mean, the karma you're creating. Well, I'm only doing what I was told to do. I'm only doing my job. Bullshit. If Thompson and Glenn and Larry had taken that position, there would have been more and more and more murders. Okay, so we are left without excuse. You and I are left without excuse. You have to act in a proper moral way, or you and I have absolutely no excuse. So anyway, like I said, I don't want to hammer on this. I mean, I've said enough about it, I think. So I think I'm pretty much done for
Well,
talking.
well, Winston, this was, a very impassioned conversation
Oh
because
yes,
it really goes to the very heart of each individual, each one of us, and it is about personal accountability, which, it's really everything that we've talked about on Country Roads is about personal accountability, and you really can't. Uh, but you've said it all. I mean, you've said it, and you can't really, you can't say it in another way that
and I'm
might.
not taking it back.
Yeah. You can't
I
say it in
said
a,
it, and I'm not taking it back.
yeah, I don't think you could say it in another way to get the point across. I think it's,
Yeah.
brilliant. You're brilliant with
Very graphic about what
really.
happened.
Yes, it was. Well, we can't forget that. I mean, it's the emotion, it's that emotional response and that we feel upon hearing these stories that go right to the heart of who we are. And we've said this on other reports that we have to be the ones to stand up and say, you can say it, Winston. We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. You go ahead and say it. You say you do it better than I would.
Well, I think people get the point. And, like I say, every little bit helps. Every little bit helps. And so a person in a wheelchair or somebody who's bedridden could do something. And that is, they could call their friends, they could talk about it and things like that. So don't think you can't do something about it. You can, because every little bit helps. Now, are you going to be the one out arresting people and putting them in jail and all that kind of stuff? Probably not. But what can you do? What can you do? What can you contribute to make the world a better place? And everybody, unless you're dead,
Well,
can do a little something. I'll put it that way. So don't feel like that your effort, is not worthwhile.
I don't think we should be deceived by the vessels that we're in. I mean, we're all souls, and if we look at each other as souls, we might really we might behave a little differently. We might act a little bit
Yeah,
differently.
I
And
think so.
when you just look at someone as a soul, and and not this, I guess maybe emotionless, uh, animated character or something,
Uh-huh.
it makes a big difference because you can of course relate to that if you have a soul. If you don't have a
Yeah,
soul, then you're the problem.
yeah, yeah.
Isn't
That's
that right?
probably true.
But
Yeah,
it's about having a conscience. So we're going back to some psychology terms, but it's about having a conscience, and those who have a conscience versus those who lack a conscience. But I think that it's very well said, Winston. I really liked how you did the Ho'oponopono, and you said, I'm sorry I didn't recognize my divine origin or my whatever it was that you had said,
yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
that I think would be really healthy for us to do on ourselves, absolutely, as you were suggesting, because um, we have to forgive ourselves too, because we have been, um, you know,
Yeah, that's
betrayed.
actually one of the shortcomings that a lot of people experience is they're willing to forgive others, but they don't forgive themselves. And
Yeah,
I think that's the main issue with Ho'oponopono, is learning to forgive yourself.
it's huge. It's not easy to do, but find a
Oh,
picture of yourself. Get a picture of yourself in your mind. And what I would suggest too is even just kind of surrounding it with like this bubble of energy love, you know, and then doing it. I don't know. I kind of added that extra step, but I found that helpful. In fact, it's so funny that you're saying
yeah.
this today, Winston, because I did that yesterday. I
Oh,
did that.
good.
I did it, and I did it for myself. So I'm saying how funny it is that you're talking about it today,
Yeah.
because yeah, because it was not easy to do for yourself.
Mm.
Yet it's that's probably the hardest thing, but we need to learn to do that. So thank you for such a wonderful message today, Winston. Really appreciate it. We're getting ready to make some major changes in the world, and we need to be ready. We need to know where we're going to go. Is it too late, Winston, for anybody to um, to redeem themselves at this point?
I can't judge that.
Yeah.
Right off the top of my head, I would say yes. For some, it is. See, going back again to the model we had created with the cross at Calvary.
Hmm.
On the one side, you had a thief who could restore, and then on the other side, you had a murderer who could not. And so, that's up to God. I'm not going to judge it one way or the
Got it.
other. But
Yeah.
if as much you ask me the question, I would have to say, yeah, probably there are some who've gone past the point of redemption in our present circumstance. They would have to be taken back to source and restructured. And I think there've been several individuals who have commented on that. So I don't think I need to
All right, very
go
good.
back over that. But to answer your question, I would say yeah, there probably are some.
Yeah, very good. Well, you can still try. I think those would know who they are, though. 'Cause you got to be pretty bad, you know, to do some
Well,
really
we see it being played
horrible
out
things,
right now. I mean,
right?
the outcome of the effort that's being made right now is obvious. The light source, the victory of the light. We're not hoping for a victory of the light. We already had the victory of the light, but yet we have some holdouts. It's kind of like,
Mm,
after World War II, years and years and years later, they would go out to some deserted island and they'd find a Japanese soldier who was still guarding his post because he simply hadn't heard the war was over yet. So I think some of these things, that we're seeing right now are very much similar to that.
I
And some
see.
of these things that go on, like this supposed missile attack on Hawaii, then one on Japan and all this kind of stuff. Those are futile efforts. Futile efforts.
Yeah,
There's no reason for them, except that those who are instigating those kind of problems are in fact brain dead. So
yeah.
anyway, yeah,
Well,
there are some kind of difficult things
right.
to figure out.
Well, you know what? Um, Victory is ours, victory of the light, and of course, and the war is over. So, you know, put them
Well,
down.
one of the things I had pointed out, we have won the war, but have we won the peace? Have we won the peace? Now that those are two different concepts, and people need to take a look at that because just because we've removed certain oppositions or in process of moving certain things, so forth, you know, what will we do? I mean, if you could go into a peaceful world, you know, what would you do? And those are things people have to look at.
Well, go into your heart, like James says. And
There you go.
you'll find the peace and love there.
I think that's the right answer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, Winston, thanks for being with us and joining us and presenting this wonderful and really inspiring message for all of us to really think about. It's good food for thought. Um, and we will be back next week for another episode of Country Roads. We have a lot of interviews we're going to be publishing. We've been working pretty hard, haven't we, Winston?
Yeah. See, this is just another branch of our hillbilly federation. It's called the Association of Appalachian Preachers. so, so, so today I've assumed the role of the Reverend, the Right Reverend Winston. And so let's hear a glory. Let's hear a hallelujah.
No, 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 no. You've gotten a new nickname. You're Mark Twain Shrout.
Oh yeah.
We appreciate it. So, Mr. Mark Twain Shrout, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's all just for fun.
Yeah, that was a good comment somebody had made about Winston in Mark Twain style, and he is kind of Mark Twainish, so that's really cool. All right, so you all have a great weekend, and we'll be back on Monday with our POTUS report with Jim Fetzer. And we have lots of great interviews. I think we're going to have supposed to have this Cobra interview out this weekend. It'll take about a week to get a transcript, maybe more, because but it'll be out eventually. We have Captain Randy Kramer talking about the med beds, and we also have Rob Potter talking about his conference coming up in July, From Venus with Love. That's the title of the conference, with his Venusian guests and all things related to that. So it's really great stuff. I mean, it's very exciting. We hope you join us. Please friend us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and to help keep these programs going, make a contribution if you can, and whatever value you think is equivalent to what you're receiving from the program in any way that you can. That would be really helpful to help keep GoldFish Report going. And please circulate this, post these videos, because Facebook, the Gestapo, Facebook has reduced our circulation to almost nothing at this point. So we really need to start networking and overcome this. You know, they're going to force us to find alternatives, and we are finding alternatives, and we will use other platforms. So they're going to really make themselves obsolete if they don't stop with their fascism and their censorship. They can't stop what's coming, no matter how much they try. So we need all of our viewers to be participants in this and to share as far and wide as you possibly can. And we can keep this going for everybody, and uninterrupted, commercial free at that. So you just keep being there and doing your part, and we'll do ours. And we want to thank all of our viewers for joining us. And this concludes this edition of the GoldFish Report.